And folks, it's my pleasure today to be with William J. Federer, who's an author and keynote speaker. He's been here in the Rochester area before. Many of you may remember that evening we spent with William Federer. We went on into the third hour. I think we hit 3.5 hours that people still weren't ready to go home. So it'll bring back some fond memories of when you were in town here, Mr. William Federer. Thanks for all you do. And he is the mind and the genius behind AmericanMinute.com, AmericanMinute.com. You can hear his podcasts there. And Mr. Federer, is there anything you'd want to share with us in terms of your thoughts about current events, very strange events in the United States today?
Sure. When you go back and look through history, and matter of fact, one of the books that I put together is called Change to Change. It's an overview of 6,000 years of world history, all the way back to Sumerian cuneiform on clay tablets in the Mesopotamian Valley. Today, that's Iraq. And when you had pharaohs and Caesars and Kaisers, sultans, czars, the most common form of government is a king. As the centuries go on, the kingdoms get bigger because with military advancements, you can kill more people. So instead of killing with a rock, you kill with an iron weapon or, bronze or phalanx spear or scimitar sword or gunpowder. The weapon changes, but it's that same fallen nature. St. Augustine called it libido dominandi, the lust to dominate. Put some kids on a playground, one's the bully hogging the ball. You put some junior high girls in a clique, and one of them is the diva. You put some people in the woods, one of them is an Indian chief, and you put them in an inner city, one of them is a gang leader. So history repeats itself, but each time it comes around, it's a little bit worse. Until finally the King of England had the largest empire on planet Earth. He was like a globalist, like a one world government guy. America's founders broke away and flipped it and made the people the king. But if we examine all the way back to ancient history, we see a human phenomenon, and that's when people are scared, they give up independence. So the first invention ever recorded was the plow. Even the Bible talks about Cain being a tiller of the soil. And then people started hitting each other with them, and they turned into weapons. And then people gravitated together for protection and formed the first cities. And when you get people together, someone's a little better at knowing how to fight than the rest. And everyone says, you be our captain. And he organizes you, you fight, you win. That's a good thing. But then this captain has kids and grandkids who claim to be an elite class, a special family, sort of a political mob boss gang. Before you know it, you got a king. And everyone wants to kiss up to this family and to this guy. And if you don't, you're ostracized, enslaved, and even killed. And so this concept is the people gave up some of their independence to concentrate power into the hands of this guy. And even if he's a good guy, his kids and grandkids may not be. Bible example, Joseph in Egypt concentrated power into the hands of the Pharaoh. And what did the Pharaoh do with that power? Well, he fed the children of Israel, gave them grain, gave them the best land at Goshen, even gave jobs to their sons to take care of his cattle. But then there was a new Pharaoh that did not know Joseph, and he used that concentrated power to oppress the children of Israel, even making them take their children and throw them in the Nile River. And so the dilemma is you get good people in power, and they want to centralize things so they can do good more efficiently, only to, at some point in the future, turn it over to someone that uses it to stay in power and oppress people. And so the answer is to separate power.
And, as you're speaking, don't forget that next point, but I'm thinking of the new nation, the autonomous community of Chaz. They've already established borders for themselves, and they've set up a police patrol, and they have a warlord who is the dominant power within Chaz. So there's this lust to dominate even within what's supposed to be this free-floating commune of socialism or communism in the center of Seattle. But let's go back to what you were saying.
Well, it's interesting. George Orwell wrote Animal Farm, and the animals all team up together and kill the farmer. He's the bad guy. But then instead of everything being equal, the pigs end up saying, well, we're the brains behind everything, so we get more apples, and you're all the workers and so forth. And you're ended up with a situation worse than before. Matter of fact, I just read the New York Times article that Amazon has decided to delete George Orwell's books. Even people that own their own iPads and their own devices and have bought the Kindle book and put it on their iPad, and it's their possession. The Amazon Kindle went into their iPad and deleted it, which is sort of interesting because George Orwell wrote the book 1984. And one of the characters in this book has a job with the Ministry of Truth. And his whole job is to re-edit history all the time, making the bad guys into the good guys. And, this perpetual war. And so here they're doing the same thing. They're re-editing history by deleting George Orwell's predictions of the Big Brother state.
And it seems to coincide what you're saying in terms of Winston inside the Ministry of Truth. He who controls the present controls the past, and he who controls the past controls the future, and he who controls the future controls the present. It's all sort of intermingled when you have American history being pulled down around us, quite literally, statues being toppled and paintings being removed, and the history needs to be sort of rewritten. It's astonishing, too. You go back to a news source online and you'll find they modify their own story. So they've actually changed it or changed the facts. But they won't say like in what way the story's been modified or changed. They just move on. So the exploitation of technology to create fear in people and motivate them to action is really present with us, as it was in George Orwell's books.
Yeah, that concept, that method has been called deconstruction. And it's where you separate a people from their past, you get them into a neutral where they do not remember where they came from, and then you brainwash them into the future you have planned for them. It's a sales technique. If I was a toothpaste salesman, the first thing I do is say negative things about the toothpaste you are currently using. You're still using that old stuff? Don't you know it'll dry out your gums and eat the enamel off your teeth? You're like, ooh, really? Didn't know that. Now you're repulsed by it. Now I have you into a neutral. You're open-minded. What are all the toothpastes out there nowadays? Then I give you my pitch for this brand new tartar-controlled breath freshener, enamel strengthening stuff, right? But that's what they do. They go into the classrooms and they tell the kids negative things about the founding fathers. They took land from India and sold people into slavery. And ooh, the students are repulsed by them. Now you got the kids into a neutral. They're open-minded. What are all the belief systems out there? Then you give them your pitch for socialism or LGBT or Islam. And so we see this practice of erasing. It's like gene therapy for a culture. You take out the old DNA and you put in the new. You take out the old identity and you put in the new. There was the Warring States period in China where you had a half dozen different kingdoms fighting, and finally they were united into the Han Dynasty, and the emperor was Qin Shi Huangdi. And I know I'm not pronouncing that right, but he unifies it. But all of these other kingdoms keep criticizing him for not doing things the way they had been done before for centuries. And he got tired of being criticized because of not doing it the way it was done before. So he decided to destroy all the historical records. And anybody that was caught with the classics of history would be sent to build the Great Wall of China, or would be tattooed and have their house pulled down and everybody in their family killed. And so we would not have the classics of history of China had they not been buried in the tomb of a previous emperor, because Queen Shi Huangdi decided to destroy them all. Now, we see this happened again with Mao Zedong, with his Cultural Revolution. He wanted to erase all the history of China so that they could all embrace this new People's Republic of China. Pol Pot did the same thing in Cambodia. He so much wanted to separate from the past, he made 1975 the new year one. And he said everything prior to 1975 was irrelevant. And he decided that anybody that wore glasses should be killed. because if you wore glasses, you could read. If you could read, you knew the history, and he wanted to get rid of the history. This is a tactic in Islam. Whenever Muslims would conquer a non-Muslim country, whether it was a Hindu territory in India or a Jewish territory or a Christian territory, they would destroy all the temples, all the monuments, all the tombs, all the graves, all the artwork, and they would import their Islam. And matter of fact, that's how the Renaissance started. The Muslims were invading Greece and destroying everything, that all the Greek scholars fled west to Florence, Italy. And this flood of Greek stuff into Florence we call the Renaissance. And they fled with their Greek New Testaments. And so these Western European scholars like Erasmus could read the Greek New Testament. And this helped fuel the foundation for the Reformation. But we see this idea of destroying history so that you can bring in a new government, a new religion, new belief system. The French Revolution is a classical example. We had a revolution. France had a revolution. We had a Great Awakening revival prior to our revolution. Preachers and George Whitefield. Before France's revolution, they had a bunch of deists and atheists and secularists, and Voltaire, and with his brilliant wit, was, mocking Christianity. And so when they helped us with the revolution, you know what they got in return? Nothing but debt. And then they had a couple years where the crops failed, and all the people blamed King Louis XVI and his wife Marie Antoinette. And remember, they didn't have bread, and she said, "Oh, we'll let them eat cake." It wasn't her fault. She just lived in the court and didn't really keep up with what was going on. Well, anyway, the people decide if they can just chop off the king and queen's heads, all their problems will be solved. They chop them off, it doesn't get solved. So then they decide to chop off all the heads of the royalty, and it still doesn't get any better. Then they chop off the heads of the wealthy. They're selfish. They got extra money, and we don't have enough. And it still doesn't get any better. Then they chop off the heads of the farmers and businessmen. They have food and supplies. We don't. They're selfish. Still doesn't get any better. Then they chop off the heads of the hoarders, people that have extra food stored up in their house. They're selfish. And then they chopped off the heads of the clergy because they're preaching against all the head chopping off stuff. Then they decided to do a purge and blame the former revolutionaries for the problems, and they chopped off their heads. 30,000 people had their heads chopped off in Paris. And they decided that they were going to so totally de-Christianize France that they turned churches into temples of reason. They tore down statues, like the statue of good King Henry IV, who was trying to patch it up between the Protestants and the Catholics, tore them down. Saint Genevieve, she was the young woman that got Paris to fast and pray when Attila the Hun was scourging Europe in the 450s, the 4th and 5th century. And Genevieve got all the city to pray, and Attila skipped past sacking Paris. And so she was the patron saint of Paris. During the French Revolution, they dug up the bones of Saint Genevieve and trashed them. They didn't want done in the year of the Lord. So they decided to make 1792 the new year one of the Republic. They didn't want a 7-day week with a Sabbath rest because it went back to the Bible. So they came up with a 10-day week called a decade week. Each day had 10 hours. Each hour had 100 minutes. Each minute had 100 seconds. They said 10 was the number of man, 10 fingers and 10 toes. So they made every measurement in France divisible by 10. They called it the metric system. Maybe that's why I never really liked the metric system. And then, of course, there was a rural area called the Vendée. And they're like, we're really far away from the capital and all that corruption going on in the big city. We'll be fine. Well, they send out their secular army, and they kill 300,000 men, women, and children in the Vendée, considered the first major modern-day genocide. And, this was chaos. And they set their brand new country. It was called Equalité, Liberté, and Fraternité. Okay, well, I understand liberté, right? Liberty. Equality can have two meanings. One is equal rights before the law, equal opportunities, or equal in the amount of possessions. And if the fraternity, the collectives, decides that you have more possessions than the rest, then the collective can take away your possessions. And Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who was called the father of the French Revolution, he said in his book, Social Contract, he says, if the state says to an individual, it is expedient for the state that you should die, that individual should die because his life is a gift made conditionally by the state. It's like, okay.
Yeah.
And then all the Marxist, socialist, communist revolutions look back to the French Revolution. This violent killing off of the previous order, tearing it down. But what happens? Well, in France's case, it turned into such chaos that Napoleon was able to take control and become a dictator, emperor. And so Plato brought out the line of reasoning that democracy without morals and virtue ends in domestic chaos, out of which a tyrant arises. And so, anyway, but so we're back to the beginning where, people hit each other, they feel insecure, they surrender their freedoms to this king. And now the French situation, they have their liberty, equality, fraternity, but it turns into this bloodshed, and out of it, power concentrates into the hands of Napoleon. And then let's fast forward to World War II. And you have the Republic, the Weimar Republic in Germany. And by the way, Wes, if you want to interject anything, just jump right in.
Well, I was going to agree with you about the all things for the revolutionary mindset. For the revolutionaries, all things that are prior need to be cast aside and destroyed. And I couldn't help but draw attention to the fact that here in Minnesota, something like 80% of the COVID-19 cases have been in nursing homes and assisted care facilities. And what I've seen happen is it seems like where these facilities were in lockdown, there should have been the greatest protection for our elders, for our senior citizens, for our walking, talking history books of our cultural traditions. And it seems like there was a sort of general culling of traditionalists and traditionalism. It's very strange to me that there isn't enough attention drawn to the numbers of COVID-19 cases that occurred in places that were supposed to be safe havens, and how that happened, and why COVID-19 patients were put into nursing homes is going to have to be addressed later on by our governor and our elected officials in various municipalities who made those decisions to put to clear out hospitals and make bed spaces, and yet to put those people amongst a population group which is anyone who, I don't need to be a doctor to understand that someone with a compromised immune system, such as an elderly person, is going to be especially susceptible to contracting an infection from a bacteria or a virus. And so another thing I wanted to touch on how virtually all of our holidays have gone away this year. Prior to Easter, all of our traditional holidays, both civic and religious, have vanished. But especially the COVID hit about a week and a half prior to Easter. And so all of the churches were ordered by the government to go into lockdown. All services were prohibited. Easter Sunday was banned. And we've gone on from there to really not celebrate Father's Day, not really celebrate Mother's Day, also Flag Day, and Memorial Day. Memorial Day, no understanding of what it means that Memorial Day is for those persons who never made it out of the uniform, right? As opposed to Veterans Day, which is for those who hung up the uniform, right? But nevertheless, our 4th of July has been canceled this summer, along with all 4th of July related activities. And we have a new holiday called Summer Celebration on August 20th, which corresponds with the Islamic calendar's New Year in this particular lunar cycle. It won't be the same next year. But this year it does happen to coincide with it. There's like a 72-hour window of opportunity where the Muslim scholars are trying to analyze, well, is it this month or is it that month yet? And they're looking at two hairs to try to see if the planetary motions are just so. But anyway, I just support what you're saying, and it's great to draw on the fact that all of these revolutions that have occurred before, everyone's trying to make the world better. They come up with their new celebrations, new holidays, new traditions, and we seem to have a church of the state centered around Earth Day, celebration of seasons, hugging the planet and so on,
Yeah, it's interesting where they said, well, you can't have 10 or more people meeting in a church. I was reading where in 1664, you had the Anglican King of England passing the Conventicle Act. Now, the Conventicle was where you had two or more people meeting. Jesus says, if two or more people meet in my name, I'm in the midst. The word comes from conventicle, from covenant, where it's, you meet together with other believers. And the government said that if you are meeting with 5 or more people and you are not Anglican and you do not have pre-approval from the government, you are all criminals and they'll arrest you. So John Bunyan, who wrote Pilgrim's Progress, was having a Bible study with some people. They bust in and arrest him, right? And then they decided that in 1714, that if you had 12 or more people meeting and you were not Anglicans, you could be planning to riot. And so the government forbade 12 or more non-Anglicans from meeting. And so they called it the Riot Act, R-I-O-T. And so you're having 12 or more people, you're having a Bible study, the police will bust into your house, they will pull out a piece of paper and they will read the Riot Act, which says you must immediately disperse. And if you do not, you'll be arrested, put in jail, and killed. And they killed them. And that went into our vernacular. Read them the Riot Act. What does that mean? That means they're going to get severely punished, and so forth.
Right.
And so
we now have a situation where after 3 months of being in lockdown, our political personalities here in town call for political demonstrations and actually help coordinate protests in our city. And some of those took place last weekend again. Not really social distancing, and politicians are speaking at these events. And then, of course, there's the new style of kneeling, which is a public prostration and shows subservience to a structure. There's several
you think of it,
there's new salutes and gestures accompanied with this new religion.
Sorry. Yeah, I didn't mean to interrupt.
That's good.
Early Christians would rather be martyred than to kneel before anybody other than Jesus. Mm-hmm. Kneeling is the universal sign of surrender. And so when they are kneeling to a mob movement, they're surrendering. It's the opposite of pledging allegiance. It's a surrender of your life. But I apologize for interrupting you there.
No, it's true. And taking that gesture further, when they're lying prostrate on the ground with their faces down in humiliation, that would have been the traditional gesture that one would make before the king. Lying on the floor and begging for one's life. And it's not an allegiance, it's a surrender, it's a capitulation, isn't it?
Yeah, it's the law of nature. When a dog shows ultimate submission, it will roll on its back and show you its vital parts. So, you could, its throat and its innards, if somebody wanted to kill it, is the way of surrendering. Yeah. So when you prostrate yourself, 2 different lines of thought that I'd like to pursue in a few minutes here. We talked about what was going on in the city. Let's analyze this. You have crime going up in cities, violence, smashing windows. Some people feel scared and insecure and decide to move out of the city. What type of people are these? Well, maybe those with families, maybe those with children. Well, pro-family, pro-children, those would statistically be more Republican. And then you have COVID shutting down businesses and extending these times of being shut down. And so you have small businessmen being put out of business, their livelihood's gone. They will leave the city. So small businessmen, they were pro-business, statistically more Republican. So crime goes up, businesses get shut down, Republicans leave. Who is left in the city? Well, maybe those that are dependent on government handouts and entitlements and welfare. Statistically, those are more Democrat. So crime goes up, businesses get shut down, Republicans leave, Democrats get a monopoly on city politics. Now, there's stories of Chicago and dead people voting, and people their names stay on the voter rolls even after they're dead or they moved away, and then they get street people to go and give them $20 to go vote in that name, then take them to another place with another name and everything. If anyone wanted to do voter fraud, there would be fewer Republican poll watchers. Yeah. So presidential election years, there's an election. Whoever wins the big city usually ends up winning the entire state. Whoever wins the state gets all the electoral votes for the state, and the president is elected by electoral votes. So the domino effect, crime goes up, businesses shut down, Republicans leave, Democrats get a monopoly, they win the city, they win the state, they get all the electoral votes for the state, they can vote in their president. It's like a soft coup.
And it's a classic way that Marxists take over a country by agitating and creating lower economic opportunities for the most disadvantaged in the society, and then co-opting the disenfranchised people's angst, if you will, and channeling that against the government. They're really co-opting, in some cases, genuine, legitimate grievances that people might have about their situations. However, they're ruining the opportunities for those situations to improve. And when they're driving out business of their communities, now Target doesn't want to go back, Walmart doesn't want to go back to Chicago. The mayor of Chicago is begging big business to stay, and they're, no, we're done with you. You let them burn, you let them riot. They're killing each other in the streets. You can do, manufacturing's leaving Minneapolis as well, and the businesses won't come back to University Avenue and Summit Avenue and so on.
But I can pretty well guarantee that the mayor of Chicago will leave on the voter rolls all of the people that left. And when election time comes, there will be votes cast under their names. And now
absentee ballots.
I mentioned, the beginning of history and people being scared and giving up their independence to form, a king. And but let's fast forward to 500 years ago. Italy was not Italy. Italy was a bunch of city-states: Venice, Genoa, Naples, Florence, Siena. And Machiavelli thought if one prince could control all of Italy, it would stop the infighting. So he writes a book called The Prince, where he advocates the ends justifies the means. In other words, the end of one prince controlling all of Italy is such a good end, because it'll stop the infighting, that any means necessary to get there is justified. Lie, cheat, steal. They called it consequentialism, that if the consequence of your actions is good, well, then anything is justified to get there. Obviously, this is not scriptural. Jesus didn't say, go out and kill people to let the world know I love them. Right? You don't do evil to do good. But this concept of Machiavellianism is it justifies doing evil if your end, you consider it good. So if a prince wants to conquer a city-state in Italy, and the city-state does not want to be conquered, they would hate him. But if the prince pays criminals to kill cows, burn barns, set buildings on fire, smash windows, the people will cry out for help. The prince will come in and kill the very criminals he bribed. Nobody will know the better for it, and everyone will praise the prince as a hero. So it's good marketing. You create the need and fill it. You go around the back of the house and set it on fire. Then you go around the front of the house and sell them a fire extinguisher. And they'll pay anything for it, and even thank you for being there. So it's called Machiavellianism, where you create or capitalize on a crisis to consolidate control. More recently, it's worded, never let a good crisis go to waste. It's an opportunity to push your big government agenda, right? Rahm Emanuel, Hillary Clinton. And so Machiavelli, 3 centuries later, Hegel. The situation is Napoleon conquers Germany. Germany was a bunch of kingdoms, Prussia, Bavaria, Saxony. And the king of Prussia said, we cannot get conquered this easily again. We need to strengthen the state. And so his philosopher was Hegel, Hegel. He was a professor at the University of Berlin. And he said the state is God walking on earth. The state is our mortal God. All the worth that a person has, he has from the state, right? Mm-hmm. This is sort of the same line of reasoning as the French Revolution. And Hegel takes Machiavelli and turns it into a triangle. One corner is a thesis. The opposite corner is an antithesis or antithesis. And the top corner is a synthesis. It sounds complicated, but it's not. In other words, you start off with a status quo, you create a problem that is real bad, and everybody is happy to settle for your answer that's half as bad. Then that becomes the new starting point thesis. You create another problem that's real bad, and everybody's happy to settle for your answer that's half as bad. And then you do it again and again and again until the people each time give up a little of their freedom, a little more, a little more, a little more, until finally they've completely transitioned from the people ruling themselves bottom up to a king ruling top down. So, who was a member of the radical student group called the Young Hegelians at the University of Berlin, followers of Hegel? Was Karl Marx.
Let me guess. Oh, really? Karl Marx? And was Friedrich Engels there as well?
I'm pretty sure he was.
Yeah.
And so what did they talk about? They said, okay, how do you create the antithesis? You send in agitators, agent provocateurs, provoking agents, community organizers, labor organizers. Their job, identify groups of people that have grievances.
Yes.
And you organize them to riot. And so they would organize the proletariat against the bourgeois, which is the poor working class against the middle class business owners. They would organize the blacks against the whites, the Muslims against the Christians, the Catholics against the Protestants, the Hutus against the Tutsis in the Congo and Rwanda. They really don't care who the two sides are, and they really don't care what the issues are. They just want a destabilizing crisis.
Yes.
David Horowitz put it this way. He says the communist trainers would say the issue is never the issue. The issue is always the revolution. He says some people think it's women's rights and civil rights. He goes, it's none of that. Those are all sub-issues. The people that think that's the issue, they're the useful idiots. He says the big issue is the revolution. So you have this Marx and Engels and the concept of going into countries and finding grievances. And the more legitimate the grievance, the better you can manipulate and use it and harness that emotion for your bigger political ends. And the people that think that you're championing their cause, they're useful idiots. And
we're seeing that play out in Minnesota exactly because the groups that have the financing in the form of operating as nonprofits outside the tax realm, even some churches are ostensibly churches are involved in that, but these groups are coming in and finding grievances, exploiting, co-opting those issues and using them to create the chaos that they can use to create change, right? And we're seeing that play out in Minnesota with a whole lot of different groups. Some of them are open society funded groups. The financing comes internationally or nationally or directly from Soros and so on. And then they'll find a narrative, right? And they found the perfect narrative in the sacrifice of this poor guy, George Floyd, right? If it hadn't been him, it would have been that eventual one spark that would set off the powder keg. But then who benefits from that human sacrifice, if you will? Well, it turns out that the donations made on the Black Lives Matter page go to Act Blue, and Act Blue supports Democrat candidates. So, you know, I've been saying to folks lately that Mr. George Floyd really deserves that horse-drawn carriage and the gold-plated casket because he's actually been the Democrat Party's major fundraiser in many, many years. But the tragedy is that the hatred and the pain that's being exploited it's a very cynical thing to take other people's grievances and turn them to your political advantage, isn't it? It's very
It,
sad.
it is. And, most people are familiar that Abraham Lincoln was a Republican. He freed the slaves. The Democrats in the Deep South had a political agenda of black codes, Jim Crow laws, and then they had a vigilante terrorist arm called the KKK. The KKK was the Democrat Party. It's important for people to understand that. And so we see that this concept of Hegel and Karl Marx and this finding people with grievances. Napoleon said religion is what keeps the poor from murdering the rich. So if you have Christians and they've been treated bad, they will just forgive, right? Our Father says, forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those. So in other words, Jesus is basically saying, if before you leave your gift at the altar, go and forgive somebody. So if you are harboring unforgiveness and hatred, you're not going to heaven. That's the message that Jesus said, right? Forgive us our trespasses as we, to the same degree. And so if you're not forgiving and you're wanting to do violence, that you're categorizing yourself, sorting out the sheep and the goats, and you're on the goat side, right? But it's interesting that Islam harnesses that offense, the idea that it's an honor shame culture, and they don't have an absolute right and absolute wrong. What is right is what brings you and your family honor. What is wrong is shame. And they will even kill their own daughter if she brings shame to the family. And so when you understand the honor shame culture and the group concept of manipulating these mob emotions. Now, I wanted to finish this line of thought. So we talked about Hegel and the French Revolution and Karl Marx. Now let's talk about the National Socialist Workers' Party. The acronym is Nazi. So the Nazi stands for National Socialist Workers' Party. And in 1933, you had Adolf Hitler be elected chancellor by one vote. And there was a whole lot of people that weren't sure about him. And Hitler had radical brown shirts. Mm-hmm. They were his version of KKK and Antifa and Black Lives Matter. What did they do? They were led by the radical homosexual Ernst Rohn, and they were called stormtroopers. They would storm into the meetings of Hitler's political opponents. They would shout down the speakers. They would bring confusion and disruption. They would lock arms and hands and block streets, block access to buildings. They would have protests that would devolve into riots. And on the Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, they smashed the storefront windows of 7,500 Jewish businesses and 200 Jewish synagogues. And so the people wanted order restored, and Hitler presented himself as the one to bring order. Mm-hmm. Of course, nobody else could present themselves as the answer because the brown shirts disrupted all their meetings. And so Hitler is swept into power. Matter of fact, there's another tragic event called the burning of the Reichstag. It's their Capitol building. Imagine if the U.S. Capitol building caught on fire. And so it was, historians suspect that it was the brown shirts that set the building on fire. Mm-hmm. And in the national confusion, Hitler arrests all of his political opponents and has them shot without a trial. When the dust settles, there's nobody else that can be a political leader against Hitler. And what does Hitler do? He has the Night of the Long Knives, mm-hmm. where he kills all of the brown shirts. Ernst Rohn had his shirt off, and he said, "Let Hitler come in and kill me himself." And they said, "No," and they just shoot him in the chest, And so now the public viewed Hitler as restoring law and order. Right. So here he is getting this group to do this crisis, sort of like Machiavelli, paying these guys to bring this disruption so that the prince can come in as the hero. And so Hitler, now, World War II is over. And Britain, which was a world empire, decided to give its colonies independence. So India gets independent, and Egypt and Jamaica and all these countries get independent. And in a perfect world, that would be nice, except for the Soviet Union. It wanted to fill the power vacuum.
Mm-hmm.
And so it wanted to make these new countries satellites of the Soviet Union. And so they would send in their KGB into Romania, into Hungary, into Syria to find people with grievances.
Mm-hmm.
Now, a world war just ended, so there are a lot of people that are in a lot of poor, bad situations. And they would organize these people saying, you want stuff and the other people are treating you bad and you've experienced injustices. We want to right that and join us. And so they would have protests that would devolve into riots, that would smash windows, set buildings on fire. And then they would bribe and threaten the media to blame the existing leader for all these things. And in the heat of confusion, they would do a coup or a rigged election and get rid of the leader and install a Soviet puppet leader. And at first, the people were relieved that order was restored. But then when the dust settled, they realized they just gave up the farm, that they just surrendered all their freedoms to this Soviet communist dictator. Now, the U.S., you had Truman as president. He was sort of naive. He thought that the United Nations would make everybody happy and everybody would be peaceful. Well, he stood by while the communists were taking over countries. And now Eisenhower is the president, and he has a choice. Sit back and let the communists take over all these new countries that got their independence, or do something about it. So Eisenhower approved the first CIA operation, Operation Ajax, to overthrow a country's leader in Iran. Iran had a leader named Mossadegh who was leaning toward the Soviet Union, and Mossadegh nationalized the oil industry in Iran. You think, what's that? Well, Winston Churchill changed the British Navy from coal to oil, and Britain only had one oil well. And so in 1908, they started the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. You know it better as BP. British Petroleum is the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. And now the Mossadegh nationalized it. In other words, took it away from the Brits, and they still need oil. And now the British go to Eisenhower for help. Eisenhower gives approval for Secretary of State John Foster Dulles to do this Operation Ajax. And who was the CIA operative on the ground? Kermit Roosevelt Jr., the grandson of Teddy Roosevelt. And what did he do? He went into Tehran and recruited the most feared mobsters in Tehran and the most radical imams in Iran. And they organized protests, which devolved into riots, which devolved into attacking mosques and setting buildings on fire and smashing things. And they co-opted and threatened the media so they could control the narrative of blaming Mossadegh for all the problems. And when the whole country was stirred up into confusion, they put Mossadegh under house arrest, locked him away for the rest of his life, and installed the Shah, who was pro-American. And we did it in 1954 in Guatemala, 1960 in the Congo, in the Dominican Republic, and even 1973 in Chile. Now, the Soviets didn't sit back. They sent their KGB to help Castro to take over Cuba and then take over other countries in Latin and South America and in Africa and so forth. And, in the Far East, and China falls to the communists. And so this is called the Cold War. And it's basically the material for every spy novel. Right? You go to some third world country, and what do you find? The Russians, the KGB, and then there's the CIA, right? And then they're going to assassinate some leader.
Retired people from Mussolini's army could even be found in parts of the world at their outposts, in the 1980s. It's astonishing. Yeah, you would meet some real colorful characters in some of those nations. Yeah.
And so what we are seeing in America right now is one of these CIA, KGB type operations. The only difference, this time it's on our own soil. And there's some concern because it's pretty clear there are elements inside of the Department of Justice, inside of the FBI and the NSA that do not like President Trump and have already put forth illegitimate efforts to get him taken out.
It's astonishing that you can have the left accuse people on the right of being literally Hitler or being Nazis, and they're actually marching in the streets, and they're throwing bricks, and they're attacking officers of the peace, and they're pillaging and setting buildings on fire. We've had about 5 different Jewish speakers here in Rochester, and one of them was even a Holocaust camp survivor. And every time there would be red flags going up on the liberal side. Oh, why are these speakers here? You know, a speaker coming to talk about her new book, London Stand. You know, we've had journalists, female Jewish journalists speak in Rochester, and the only people who put up any kind of opposition were from the left. So it's bizarre to me that they are able to escape the origins of the tactics that they're coming from and sort of say to people on the conservative side, you know, Trump is literally this or that, and some really insulting things too, you know, also making reference to race when they call him orange, right? So they're using racism, you know.
Well, it's a tactic called psychological projection. Sigmund Freud coined the term, where rude people call everyone they don't like rude. We've all met someone like that. Little kids do it. I didn't start it. You started it. So it's called blame shifting, where the attacker blames the victim. So wife beaters will beat the tar out of their wife and say, it's your fault because you provoked me. Sharia Muslim men will rape a woman and say, it's your fault that I raped you because you tempted me. All right, the attacker blames the victim. They'll come into a very tolerant community, and their presence there proves the community's tolerant, and then they'll accuse their host, community of being intolerant. It was attributed to Stalin, but it's accuse your opponent of what you're guilty of. And so David Axelrod was President Obama's campaign manager, and he was on NPR radio April 2010, and he said, in Chicago politics, we have a tradition where you throw a brick through your own campaign office window and then call a press conference to accuse your opponent. In other words, you do the crime and you accuse your opponent of that exact crime. So let's say there is a candidate running for president that's colluding with Russia, giving away 1/5 of the U.S. uranium in exchange for $145 million Russian contributions to her Clinton Foundation. She wants to accuse her opponent of colluding with the Russians. Yeah. He has to go on the defensive. They do the whole investigation process. Why? To find and destroy all the evidence that could convict her. Hard drives, laptops, emails, text messages, all destroyed. And if the public ever wises up, by this time the water is muddied and the public doesn't know who to trust, and she gets a pass. Yeah. Then there's another presidential candidate that is extorting Ukraine and saying, drop the investigation of my son or I'm going to hold back U.S. money. Well, what does he do? Want to accuse his opponent of extorting Ukraine. So why do you want to use the exact same crime you're doing? Because it gets name associated in the media. So this candidate's name, the crime, this candidate, and most people only read the headlines. And they say, well, this person's name is associated with this crime, and it goes into their subconscious. And and then this tactic is always also teamed up with something called seizing the moral high ground. And so you want to present yourself as being more moral than your opponent. What's an example? Casinos. If a casino wants to move into a community and the community doesn't want it, they'll say, wait a second, you're going to bring crime and prostitution and drugs and all kinds of this riffraff. But if the casino donates a little money to schools, They can put a big billboard and say, we care about the children. If you care about the children, you'll vote for proposition such and such. And if you don't vote for this, you must hate the children.
It's funny that
Right?
we just saw that play out literally here in town, where a massive mail campaign was used, full color advertising, distributed to the community, saying you need to support this bond bill because the attendance is going up and we're having more children. Everyone votes yay and passes the bonding bill. Lo and behold, fast forward 8 or 9 months later, it turns out actually our enrollment numbers and projections for future enrollments are actually going down. So create the crisis, exploit it to get what you want, and then let the numbers come out later. And who's going to remember that they even voted? It's enough that people know there was an election held, right? Like Stalin said. Doesn't matter who counts the vote. It doesn't matter who votes. It's who counts the vote that counts.
Right. And now we've talked about some serious things, and this is serious. And when you look at 6,000 years of history, you have all these Caesars and Pharaohs and Caesar and, Attila the Hun, Genghis Khan, and they're all lusting for power. If any one of them hadn't have died, they would be happy to have the world under their thumb by now. And so it's almost a blessing. And, every one of us has a selfish, fallen human nature that would want to prefer our family and friends. And so we'd end up setting up some type of pyramid structure. And so God just basically says, okay, nobody gets to eat from the tree of life, after, because you have to get, born again, because after you ate from the knowledge of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. So as the centuries go on, these kingdoms get bigger. Augustus Caesar wanted to track everyone in his empire. It was called the census.
Yeah.
Augustus Caesar wanted a worldwide census, something about dictators that want to track everyone. And So we see the end goal is a one world government. That's what they want. They want to create this crisis, and then they want to present, you even have people wanting global. Imagine there's a billionaire saying we got an overpopulation and we can lower the population through vaccines. And then there's a COVID thing. He says, hey, let's vaccinate everybody in the whole world and then track them. And it's like,
here's another brilliant aspect of that they're rolling out currently. It's actually admitted by a local politician this morning again that our government officials are under the supervision of the Council of Europe, because Rochester, Minnesota is one of the only city in the United States of America to place itself under supervision by the Council of Europe. That's going to mean that our government officials will be interviewed by a carefully trained specialist from Europe who will assess them for their levels of implicit bias, wrongthink, getting back to the Ministry of Truth, right, in 1984, but interview them and give them a score for their implicit bias or their susceptibility to systemic racism, right? So create the bogeyman, the come into a community, identify the bogeyman, create a dangerous situation, and then provide the solution in terms of a one world government or a one world religion under the supervision of some EU bureaucrats from France.
Yeah. So that's their ultimate goal. Now, when you look at it and says, "Oh, it's depressing. What can we do about it?" In reading history, every single generation of humans have lived during a crisis. And whether it's Attila the Hun with an army of 500,000 men wiping out cities, whether it's Genghis Khan killing 30 million, whether it's Ivan the Terrible of, wiping out Novgorod, Russia, or bubonic plagues or whatever, there's always been crises. And there's three groups of people categorize themselves three ways. One is they're part of the problem. Two is they ignore the problem. And three is they try to be part of the answer. And minister God's love to those that are hurting and stand up for righteousness when there's evil abounding. And this is just our turn. And the only way I get encouragement is to see it from this providential long-term perspective. And, there's the song Amazing Grace, and how, your sins are washed away. In other words, God's a just God. He has to judge every sin. But he's a loving God in that he provided the lamb to take the judgment for the sin, right? So Abraham's, taking Isaac to the top of the mountain, and the son says, Dad, where's the lamb? And he says, God will provide himself a sacrifice. And it can be read two ways. Well, God will provide a lamb, or no, God will provide himself as the sacrifice. So God is just, and then he judges every sin, but he's love and he provides himself. And so Jesus, the Son of God, is the sacrifice. I do a little equation. An eternal being who's innocent, suffering for a finite period of time, is equal to all the finite beings who are guilty, suffering for an eternal period of time. So he's the only one that could have paid the penalty for all of our sins. Long and short of it, the song Amazing Grace, when we've been there 10,000 years, bright shining as the sun, with no less days to sing his praise than when we just begun. Imagine being in heaven 10,000 years and you meet, all the great saints of old, and there's Moses. And you just can't help yourself. You say, Moses, tell us, what was it like? And, the room will get quiet and he'll say, well, I was 80 years old and Pharaoh was charging in at us with these chariots and these swords and we were unarmed and I just held up my staff and I said, God, use me to deliver your people. And the waves came in. And then we'll see David. Say, David, tell us your story. He'll say, I was just a teenager and this thug Goliath was mocking our God and these grown-ups were too chicken. And I said, well, enough of that. Took my little sling and went out there and hit him in the head. And we'll just be enthralled by all these great stories. And then everyone will look at you. So you tell us your story. What was going on when it was your turn to be down there on earth? What did you say when the whole world was against you and the baby in the mother's womb and marriage that God himself instituted in Genesis? I mean, every single, insect, there's male and female. Birds, male and female. Fishes, male and female. Mammals, male and female. It's like, okay, I think there's a pattern here. God instituted that the man shall leave the father and mother, cleave to his wife, two shall become one. Well, in other words, there's a lot of crises and everyone's going to look at you saying, what did you do? I'd hate to squirm in my seat and say, well, I flip the channels every now and then when the wrong things came on. And no, I'm going to say, let me tell you about it. I just couldn't take it anymore. And I just had a little sling in my hand, a little staff in my hand. I didn't have a whole lot, but I decided, God, use me to make a difference. And Proverbs says a good man leaves an inheritance to his children's children. So we do what we can, have the Lord inspire us, give us ideas like you're having the idea for this podcast, so forth. We do what we can and we trust him with the rest. And anyway, I think it's an exciting time to be alive. And I'll end with that.
Thank you for having made that beautiful case for being wise as serpents and yet harmless as doves, because ours is a call to action with words, just using words, and we beat those swords into plowshares because we need peace to go back to work again in Minnesota. We've been in this lockdown now for so long, and everyone just wants to get back to building and making and doing. So I just want to thank you, William J. Federer. He is his podcasts are found at AmericanMinute.com. And if there's any other preferred social media, check out his new book, Change to Chains and Who is the King? Many other books are available online. Is there one website where people can find your books at? Is it AmericanMinute.com?
Yes, AmericanMinute.com. And I send out a free daily email as well.
Excellent. And sign up for that email. Keep in touch. Be part of his work and his words of encouragement. Share it with your friends. Like, subscribe to his information. And we hope to see you again one day in Minnesota. We're still under lockdown here. We can't meet with more than 10 people. There's some kind of restrictions. It's hard to keep track of what they are. But as an essential worker, I have papers in my vehicle so I can go to work. But thank you for all you do, Mr. Federer, and you're an encouragement as always.
Thank you. God bless you and everyone that's viewing this, and look forward to being on the next time.
Thank you, sir.